Hello everyone. In this video, we'll be going over the Pandas essentials, which is pivot, cast, melt, and pivot table. Link to the blog post is in the description if you want to follow along with the blog post. Otherwise, let's begin. So this is a very quick and simple tutorial. We'll be first loading our libraries. We'll be taking the flights dataset, which is already pre-built datasets in the C1 package. That's why we are loading C1. There's no need of C1 otherwise. So we take a look at the flights. Now we see that the flights is like we have the year, the month, the number of passengers. Now suppose that you want to create a table which had the year as the rows and month as the columns. So something like year goes here and months goes here and the number of passengers everywhere, just like we have here. So how would you go from here to here? So that's where the pivot functionality in Pandas comes in. Now pivots essentially takes a long form of the data and converts it to a wide form. So the pivot is very simple. So you take your data frame, so flights dot pivot, and index none columns none values none. Index is the index you want here as the index column. Columns is the ones which you want to pivot. So in this case, we want to pivot the month column and values. Which values do you want to populate it here? We want to populate the passengers values. So we do flights dot pivot, index as year, columns as month, and passengers as values. So as you can see, year comes here. Let me just run this code again. So as you can see, year comes here, year, month, and you see the values being populated. Here we can verify the values 1949, January 112, February 118, 112, and 118. Now this is the pivot. But what's the difference between pivot and pivot table? Now, pivot can only transform your data. It cannot do any aggregations on it. There are no aggregation functionalities in pivot. If you want to do aggregations, you will have to use pivot table. So again, we take a scenario where I want to compute against the year. I want to compute the minimum, the maximum, and the mean number of passengers in every single year. So for this, I will need to use the pivot table. I cannot uh, do this by using just the pivot functionality. Now there are two ways to do it. You can use group by as well. That will also give you the same values. But let's just suppose that you wanted to use pivot table. So for this, you will use pivot table. The pivot table is goes values, which values you want to aggregate upon, which is the index. If you give index as none, the index goes away. It replaces the index with just 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Columns, basically which columns you want to aggregate upon, uh, if there are any columns that you want specifically to aggregate, and the aggregation function. If the columns are none, then all the columns are used for aggregation. So let's say in this case, I want to use month. Uh, so I give value as passengers. This is the value. Index is equal to year. I want to keep the year as index. As you can see here, I want to keep the year as index. Uh, and what I want to do is I want to use aggregation function of max, min, and mean. So as you go year, max, min, and mean. So this pivot table can help me create this aggregation functionality. It is very much similar to the pivot table you will find in Excel or in G Sheets, right? Now let's come back to cast and melt. Now, when should we use the pandas melt functionality? So we will be using the pandas melt functionality when we want to go from a wide form like this to a long form. Now a long form is something like this. The original flight data is in long form here. Year, months, and value. Year, months, and value. Year, months, and value. And a wide form of the data is something like this, where you have the year, months, and value split in all the columns. Supposedly that you started off with this table, that you started off with only this table. Let's say you just started off with the flights wide data. I just named it as a variable flights wide is equals to pivot, uh, same functionality, the flights wide. And I wanted to reach here. I wanted to convert my data from this wide form to a long form. Then I can do that easily with the melt functionality in Pandas. Now the melt functionality goes melt. What is the value name that you want to get? As you can see, there is no value name here. It's just the months. ignore index as false. The reason why I use ignore index as false is because I want to keep the index here, and automatically it takes the other the column names as the column name here. So if I take I create my flights wide data and I just melt it, as you can see, I get my original data frame back. And to get the original data frame back, I can just type as reset index here. And as you can see, this is exactly the data which I had before. So remember this. This is the most important thing that you have to remember, that if you want to go from long form to wide form, you use pivot. If you want to go from wide form to long form, you use melt. Now the question is, where is cast? Well, people who are coming from our programming language, they always want to find out where is cast in Python. Well, there is no cast functionality in Pandas, but the cast functionality and the pivot table functionality are pretty much similar. So wherever you used to use cast, you should use pivot table. Hopefully this clears up this very essential concept about Pandas, about pivot, pivot table, and melt, and also cast way. If you like this video, do like and subscribe, and follow the blog mlexplain.blog. Thank you for watching.